Hello everybody, welcome to Awesome Rusty Bucket. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already and drop a like on this video. It only takes 1 second. It makes a massive difference in how the video performs in the YouTube algorithm. Also, real quick, if you have not already, go check out episode 3 of my Spurs My NBA series, going over the end of our first season, as well as who we will draft in 2024. Really enjoying that series, really enjoying you guys, really enjoying the series. The people who watch it really seem to love it. Even if you're not really into 2K stuff, if you enjoy just rebuilding stuff and like trades and shit like that, it's an enjoyable series, 2K aside. But with that said, it's hot takes. Let's get into it. There's never been more parity in the NBA than 2020 to now. I think there was more parity in the 1970s, but I don't know if it was necessarily paired with talent that made it to where you really gave a shit. The thing about the 1970s era of the NBA was different teams were winning different championships every year, but the lack of parity and also how many players were in the ABA kind of just watered down the product and didn't give it an actual image, you know what I mean? And that's kind of the downside of no parity, or that's kind of the downside of having the parity, is that the eras don't really get an identity if you do that. Really, if you think about it, the 1960s have a very strong identity with Bill Russell's Celtics and Wilt Chamberlain, Oscar Robertson. The 70s have Kareem and the Seattle Supersonics winning a title, the Boston Celtics winning some championships with John Havlicek and guy whose name I can't remember right now. So yeah, Dave Cowens, that's who it was. It's interesting. Rick Barry's Warriors, you know, there's stuff in there, but it's not necessarily the best, and the talent was a little bit diluted at that point in the NBA. But now we have an extremely talented NBA, the most talented it's ever been, and parity paired with that. It's gotten to the point where there's just so many talented players in the league, you really don't get cupcake matchups. You do occasionally, if a team's just really committed to being bad, but if an NBA team wants to be competitive, NBA teams pretty much universally will be competitive. If from the front office point of view, they're trying to be a good basketball team, you're gonna get at least a pretty decent basketball team just because there's so many good players to choose from. But yeah, I do think it's fair to say, like, the people who have won the titles the past couple of years, I don't know if I've correctly predicted the champion in a while, like since the Raptors didn't predict that. The Lakers were not a tough prediction. I thought the Lakers were gonna win. I think I got that right. The Bucks, the Warriors, the Nuggets, never picked them to win it, at least at the start of the season. I think the Nuggets were my runner-up prediction for this previous year. But yeah, there's a shitload of parity is the ultimate point we're arriving to. Embiid has never played in a complete offensive scheme, just feed him the ball offenses that historically do not work in the playoffs. While I will definitely say that Embiid, I agree, has not really had creative offenses around him, I also don't know if Embiid is the type of player that needs a creative offense, and Embiid is really built for it. Not that Embiid can't work within that type of system, but I think he's just such a ridiculously good isolation scorer. It's like it makes sense that you naturally arrive to just doing that. He does pick and roll stuff, but he's not the quickest. He's not the best pick and roll option in the world. Mid-range pick and pops are cool. His three ball's cool, but really where he's most effective is when you give him the ball on the block and you let him either take a face-up jumper or just bully someone until he gets into the paint and either gets fouled or makes the shot. It's kind of like if you have a guy whose primary ability is isolation, that's ultimately going to arrive towards playing in isolation. And isolation players can fit within those types of systems, like Kevin Durant with the Warriors, for example, but ultimately, if you're not giving them that type of offense, and if anything, if you're not making it a large percentage of it, you're kind of doing that player a disservice. I think Embiid in like a Warriors-like system, for example, at least individually would not thrive as much. Maybe you could argue it's a more winning circumstance, but I do agree. I think I'm perfectly fine with an offense built around just Embiid isolation. I just think it's more about the players around him. The only time he's really had the proper help around him was with the Jimmy Butler team. Embiid, I believe, was dealing with a lot of injuries for that postseason. Not that that's an uncommon thing. So yeah, I think if there's anything that's really Embiid's Embiid's biggest hindrance as an isolation scorer is because he has the ball so much, and he is not really that great at making the decisions with the ball when he's not scoring, especially dealing with the pressure of a double team. That can really be his undoing, and that's something that a new system would hopefully avoid him having to deal with as much. Playmaking is more important for an offensive player than scoring is at the highest level. I don't know if I would say more important, but I do think playmaking can really differentiate between the effectiveness of how good a scorer is. There's a thing I harp on all the time here. Scoring and playmaking have a connected relationship. They are not separate entities. If you're a really good scorer, that's going to give you opportunities to playmake more so than someone who's not a really good scorer. And if you're a really good playmaker, that can give you more opportunities to score than someone who is not a good playmaker. As I previously mentioned, Joel Embiid, how he deals with double teams, contrast that with how Nikola Jokic deals with double teams. And you see that Jokic doesn't get double teams all that much because of how well he deals with them, which obviously not having a double team to deal with makes it a lot easier to score the ball. And if you're a really good scorer, you're going to draw the attention of the defense with your gravity, and that gravity is going to create opportunities for your teammates. You then just have to be a good enough passer to actually capitalize on those opportunities, realize them, and make the proper pass. So a player like Zach LaVine, for example, who can score the shit out of the ball but just does not make great decisions in terms of passing it, he's going to be significantly less effective than, I don't know, like Jayson Tatum, who's also an excellent scorer but can also really pass, or a hyper example being Luka Doncic, who can really score but also can really pass. It really makes a significant difference. And in the case of players like Luka, in the case of players like Jokic, if you took away the playmaking or you took away the scoring, you would make them significantly worse at the thing that you didn't take away. So I don't know if it's more important, but I do think you need the high scoring ability to be that crazy offensive threat. You can't just be like Rajon Rondo and not be a scoring threat but playmake. That doesn't lead you to being a dominant offensive player, but you definitely need to have that playmaking ability to be a dominant offensive player as well. It's kind of like if we're arguing about one without the other, I think it's fairly silly. Both of them are very important, and if you don't have the other, it's going to make the impact of the other, the one that you do have, much less so. Hopefully I explained that properly. The idea of a player's playstyle not being ideal for winning basketball is inconsistent and ironic, especially when the player's playstyle is the only reason they have anything good in the first place. But people want to blame the player instead of everything else that has dragged them down, like coaching, teammates, and shit organization, but instead blame the one good thing about that team. I agree and I disagree. There are a lot of different ways to win championships, and there are a lot of different play styles to do that. And I think a lot of people are far too quick to suggest that a type of play style is just guaranteed to have a losing result every time. Even I, someone who like hates on heliocentric offenses, for example, can see like there's exceptions like Nikola Jokic, who's very heliocentric, but kind of knocks away the negatives by not being a big time ball handler. Or you can get a player like James Harden, who, yeah, James Harden never won a championship, but at his peak with a very good team around him, he very nearly beat the greatest team of all time. I understand it's not the same as winning a title, but that was just an unfortunate obstacle where otherwise that team was so good and easily better than most championship teams in my personal opinion. But that said, a certain play style can make winning a lot harder than another play style. And there are some times where a franchise will build around a player, and ultimately you kind of have to come to the conclusion that they just built around the wrong player because that play style just isn't built to win at the highest level. You know, if you have, let's say, Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum, and those are your star players, that's just not going to get the job done, even if that play style is one that can win win a championship, you're going to need hyper-specific circumstances, like let's say instead of CJ McCollum, it's Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo, to really elevate that type of play style into a championship form. Someone like Trae Young or Luka Doncic are examples of this, kind of harping on that heliocentric idea. They would probably be more effective at winning if they dialed that aspect of their game back, but also it's pretty radical and stupid to suggest they should just completely throw out the baby with the bathwater. So yeah, I mean, there are players who you can look at their play style and be like, yeah, the play style is ultimately the problem, because that is the core of the team. The central idea, the central force of a team being the wrong central force, it doesn't fucking matter what you put around that player at that point. You can build around John Collins all you want. You can build the perfect team for John Collins. If that's your best player, RIP. I don't know why I picked John Collins. He was just on the mind, apparently. Most star players today are better basketball players than players of the past. I'm fine with ranking Larry Bird in the top 10 for his career and stats, but Jayson Tatum is a better basketball player. I don't know if I even believe this, but it's a hot take. So for that last thing, I just want to point out, when I ask for hot takes, I would prefer things that you guys actually believe. Every once in a while, I'll get someone just say something absolutely ridiculous. Someone replies to it, and they go, yeah, I don't even believe it, but I wanted to say something that was hot. I understand why you might arrive to that conclusion, but ultimately it's much more fun if this is something that you genuinely believe. But just choosing to take this point of view at face value, I understand what you are saying. The ultimate conclusion that I come to is everything's in the context of its era. Like, Larry Bird would be liberated to be a better player in a modern context. I very much believe he would be a better player in a modern context. Maybe he doesn't necessarily stand out from the crowd as significantly as he did in the 1980s because there's just more competent talent all around, but spacing, for example, that's really the most obvious thing, just makes life so much easier for offensive players. And the fact that Larry Bird cooked to the degree that he did with everyone on top of each other just makes you have to wonder, what would he do if he had a lot more room to operate and a lot more options to pass to? So because of that, I view it as these players would be better in the modern context more often than not. There are all-time great players like, you know, maybe like Bill Russell, who I don't necessarily think would improve and be like, Bill Russell would not win 5 or 4 or whatever it was MVPs in the 2020s, and some players would be worse than others, but at least especially in the case of guys who were good offensive threats, yeah, they'd be better than not. Larry Bird was the second best player or third best player, depending on who you ask, for most of his peak, often the best player even. Jayson Tatum's like 10th or whatever, 8th, I don't know. It's all within the context of its era, and I don't know. I think it's pretty difficult, and we'll always get into rough semantics when it comes to this. There is no solution here. Darius Garland is better than Ja Morant. I could see the point of view that he's a more skilled player, specifically because he's just such a better jump shot. I do think he has a more conservative and high feel for the game approach, but that said, there is something to be said for wiring and having a quote-unquote like superstar mentality. The thing I've always said about Ja Morant is he very much has the wiring and that mentality of a superstar player, so much so that it often will exceed his actual basketball ability. He obviously has an insane amount of basketball ability, but I think Darius Garland is arguably one of the like bare minimum 15 most skilled players in all of basketball right now. But Darius has a much more conservative approach, and there are certainly moments with him where you're like, you wish he would be more aggressive and assertive and be the true lead option you can rely on, where Darius Garland, I feel, will always be a secondary option, and Ja, at least conceivably, could be that first option. I don't know. I think it really depends on what you personally value. And if I was trying to like have a player lead a franchise, I would go with Ja Morant over Garland. Although if I was going to have someone be the secondary player I would go with Darius Garland. So it really depends. Mikhail Bridges has gotten incredibly overrated after his Brooklyn stint. His three-point and mid-range shooting was unsustainably hot, and he still lacks rim pressure, playmaking, and good enough handle to be a top scoring option. I think to some degree that's true. I don't think he's going to be like a 26 point per game scorer. But the guy was up to like 17 points per game in Phoenix. I think it's very conceivable he'd be like a 22 point per game guy for the foreseeable future, on top of being a good defender. He's not necessarily a very good playmaker and doesn't have a lot of rim pressure, as you say. I think his ball handling's serviceable enough to get to his spots, which is all that really matters. I also don't know that I agree that the shooting was unsustainable. I do think that he can sustain it, maybe not as scorching hot as he did, but like he can definitely be a very good shooter from all over the floor. He has shown signs time and time again that he can be that guy in that department. Yeah, I think a little overrated is fair, but ultimately he's still very, very, very good, and I'm glad he's gotten that opportunity in Brooklyn. But yeah, that is it. Again, go check out that Spurs My NBA, and shout out to Rudy for editing this video, and goodbye.